Hey everybody, I'm back with my friend Mike Jacob, who's wearing his Tommy Bahama shirt or something like that. It's a Hawaiian shirt. To which I told him if I had have known, I would have worn mine, and we have dedicated this program in memory of PG&E Public Affairs honcho and friend Tom Garino. But well, I sort of just did it, didn't
You did.
I?
You did. Although Tom could pull that off year round, we can only pull it off on Fridays in the summer.
Exactly. Yeah, here I am wearing black, and it's 97% humidity, and it's 80 something degrees outside. Ha ha! Great to see you, man. My Raider colors. Anyway, Mike. First of all, from your perspective, a quick update on where the project is from the perspective of PMSA.
Yeah, and thanks for having me on as always, Annie. I appreciate the forum and the dialogue. Yeah, we're at that very critical place in the project where the regional planning question has been called. Um, on June 30th, there needs to be a discussion and a vote up or down from BCDC on whether or not this project is going to be allowed to move forward with the removal of the port priority use area. And it's a culmination of a lot of work and effort over a long period of time by the A's as a project applicant. And it's definitely one of those milestones that should not be taken lightly. This isn't a small vote. This is a vote as to whether or not the conversation can continue.
I want to ask you about an entry I saw on the website of the Bay Conservation Development Commission. And for those of you who don't know what BCDC does, it is responsible for authoritative approval of proposed development projects anywhere within a diagrammed boundary that basically comprises the inner shore of, or should I say, the shore of San Francisco Bay Area, as far south as San Jose, as far north as Antioch, and points around that area, right?
Yeah.
And so, hence, uh, the multi-port BCDC has uh, some say in the future of this project. Now, originally, the Special Project Area Committee decided, not area committee, but Special Project Committee decided by a very narrow margin against Howard Terminal. And of course, there was a special meeting on June 2nd. And then I saw a one giant paragraph note that referred to a recalibration of the estimates from the Port of Benicia, which has it, if I have read it correctly, and I believe I have, that the re-estimate of Benicia is such that Howard Terminal could be developed as a ballpark without, for want of a better term, damaging the long-term ability to handle expanded cargo under a slow or moderate growth example, although there's some debate as to the moderate growth aspect of that. Am I right?
There's definitely a lot of debate around that. And that is going to be a key issue moving forward. Absolutely. Um, one of the components of the long-term cargo forecast that BCDC has to do in order to make these types of decisions is to weigh exactly what you're talking about. How much land do we have available versus what's the potential for future growth? How much port priority use area do we need in the bay? And they get down to a pretty granular level in those forecasts. Asking questions about how much acreage do you need for containerized cargo versus autos versus break bulk cargo. And those types of numbers have been in flux and debated now for the last 2 years. We are not surprised that there's ongoing debate about that, even though a lot of those issues were initially put to bed back in May of 2020, just because that's the nature of what we're dealing with here, right? We have a a project which is not going to go away quietly. The fact that the Seaport Planning Advisory Committee voted to recommend to keep the port priority use area for Howard Terminal on the basis of the existing cargo forecast, of course, opened up the cargo forecast to additional scrutiny and criticism by the A's.
If I may, folks, that was the SPAC I was referring to.
Yeah.
I just got mentally discombobulated for a second.
No, you're good. And so,
To which Garino would say, have another drink, Zenny.
especially on a Friday afternoon.
Exactly.
So I think we have a pretty good handle on what's being asked of BCDC with respect to some of those changing numbers, right? The question is how fast do you run out of property is really what's being asked when you're adding additional acreage here versus there. It changes the rate at which that property gets used under a projection formula. So this is, half art, half science. It's a long-term cargo forecast. But the folks who do it have to have a basis for making those recommendations. And even if you're inclined to agree or disagree with the outcome, the methodologies need to be consistent. And so there's an independent basis for making those determinations. And some of the criticism of the forecast has been, why are you including some acreage versus not including other acreage? And that there's a level of arbitrariness to it. Well, there's a level of arbitrariness to every type of long-term cargo forecast, just as there is for any other type of long-term economic forecast where you make assumptions, you have parameters, and once you've set those parameters, you try to make your estimates as accurate as possible within that set of assumptions that base your parameter set. And that's what they did. So, we're inclined to believe that the way that it was originally set up is appropriate and proper. But even if you disagree with it, the change in the number of acres that are there doesn't really change the reality on the ground. And I think that's what people need to keep in mind. When you think about the Port of Benicia in particular, there's no additional amount of cargo throughput that is changed on the ground, because in a report talking about what's going to happen 3 decades from now, you include a couple of other acres on the left side of the freeway versus the right side of the freeway, or vice versa. And if that's the kind of specificity that this project approval is coming down to, then we've really elevated the science of the projection of these long-term cargo forecasts, because, really as a policymaker, whether you run out of property in 2050 or 2055 really shouldn't be the basis on which you're making these decisions. It's how do you maintain, from our perspective, obviously, it's how do you maintain the most amount of industrial waterfront property possible. And that's where that tension comes from. That's why this meeting's so important.
Yeah, I want to add on to what you're saying as a person who's an expert in system dynamics modeling. And for those who don't know what that is, it's a modeling paradigm that's created by Jay Forster at MIT in 1956 and expressed in a book called Business Dynamics and Industrial Dynamics. But the idea behind the diagrammatical approach of system dynamics is to lay out what your mental model may be regarding, in other words, what your idea is regarding how growth happens and how ports are impacted in this case versus mine or someone else's. The BCDC didn't do that. It gave this sort of black box approach, which I think is 20 years behind how things should be done. That's just my opinion, because you're right. Essentially, no one knows. No one has the right idea. But system dynamics allows us to see what our thinking looks like. Okay, and it can be challenged by somebody else easily, and you can try other runs and everything else.
Right. Now, the place where if we have some criticism of the report, it's actually that it has, if it's possible, too much of an emphasis on productivity increases as part of a assumption of what's going forward. We produced some comments, and I know I've sent you some of our supplemental comments, some of our very original comments on the plan.
Right here.
Yeah, we can get into those in just a sec. But some of our very original comments were more about the question of productivity. Essentially, what the projections are that our productivity gains in our workspace in the Bay Area will essentially outpace our growth rate. And we just don't think that that's realistic or sustainable over time for a lot of reasons. But I think that's where that feedback loop, that system dynamic that you're looking for, is really built into this forecast. It's not meant to be a static forecast because it doesn't just focus on the demand side. It also does touch on this question of how are you managing the ability to become more efficient over time. And it does that with the productivity metric. So the productivity metric that they use actually proposes that our operations get 66% more efficient over the next 3 decades through a combination of introduction of automated and non-automated technology. And we think that's pretty aggressive. But be that as it may, it's certainly, again, a part of that mix, right? I mean, you've got a whole set of parameters to discuss, and in the context of those discussions, the BCDC plan has a matrix that is given to these policymakers. It says, here are all the different scenarios for all these different cargo mixes, and if you do it, then you're just at this place where you're right. It's just math, right?
Yep.
Where do you think you're going to land on this matrix? How much acreage do you think you're going to need? There is no right answer. There is no wrong answer. But there are informed answers and less informed answers. And then, as we point out, and we can talk about this in our supplemental comments, what are the filters for those questions? And BCDC has established those policy filters, and the policy filters are essentially a set of policy statements that they've adopted in advance before you go through a Bay Plan amendment process that they need you to look at, they need you to answer, and they need to then evaluate themselves.
Don't you think this is something that should have been fleshed out a long time ago? I don't know if you remember a guy named Ray Brady with ABAG, the Association of Bay Area Governments, but he was the local czar of long-term planning for the Bay Area, and did touch on seaport matter. But it seems to me that the question of the appropriateness of Howard Terminal should be something that we can already look to without having a recalibration or calculation, because to my mind, the result is fraught with bias one way or the other.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. And so we actually do have a process like that. And the reason why the context for this decision is what it is because we have an existing plan, right? So those plans are meant to be updated on a regular basis. There is an update planning process going on at BCDC right now. But this is proceeding faster than that because it's on its own timetable because of the legislation that they sponsored that required an action within 140 days. They didn't want to wait to be included in a brand new master plan for seaports for the Bay. They wanted to make sure that they could move forward on their own timetable.
But not to belabor a point, given our technology in terms of computers, blogs, coding, putting system dynamics models or any kind of model online very quickly and building it, it surprises me that we don't have something that we can just simply literally park a Howard Term proposal into and it spits out a result, right? Even if it's, one that's subject to some adjustment, they are. but it shouldn't take an entire reinventing of the research wheel for us to come up with an answer, given the fact that we're in the year 2022 and we've been doing things like this going back to what, way before the turn of the century, going back to the 50s. And then we just simply made them we made them easier and more accessible by digital media. So I'm just floored that it just seems like this is taking a lot longer than it should. And it looks to me that we're decades behind where we should be.
I think two things just in general. I think the big picture obviously is it's still bay planning, which is our own subset of coastal zone management planning. It's difficult on purpose, and it's part of resource management, right? I mean, that's that the value of this planning is that it isn't easy.
Right.
To change what has been done through a deliberative process. So the fact we have an existing plan, that plan has regular updates. If you're looking to deviate from that plan, which is what this is, it's a request for a plan amendment, then the system is set up broadly to not make that easy. It's set up to make that a heavy lift.
What Mike is saying in a very gentlemanly and technical way is that in Bay Area culture, everybody likes to basically whiz on a particular proposal or plan that you have. And there's a whole culture of people that want to have their say because they were employed to do that. And if we had the kind of model that I'm suggesting, some of those folks would be out of a job.
Yeah, but on the policy side too, I think you do set up those things so there's a especially for long-term planning purposes, for regional planning purposes, you want to provide a structure which is stable, in which developers and local governments can move and they can make decisions and they know with certainty where they're allowed to build and where they aren't allowed to build.
Yeah.
This does that. So, and it discourages you from going out and making a whole bunch of proposals about Bayfill, which is exactly the reason why BCDC exists.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, it's
the whole reason they exist is to tell local governments no. If they weren't there, then you would have what's again going back to just concept of regional governance and planning. You have to start from the assumption that cities and their developer partners are going to make decisions that are in the best municipal interest of their own city. And over time, what that meant for the Bay was more people over time incrementally filling the Bay, encroaching on the Bay, getting rid of regional resources that have regional or statewide or national value, but on a city by city, development by development basis, aren't really taken into account or don't consider those long-term benefits, right? So there's always a tension there between regional planning and local planning.
Well, you remember that poster? I remember it from, I think it was 1974, that posited San Francisco Bay that was a river.
That's right.
Right, because of so much inflow.
That's right. So that's by design, and that isn't just to slow things down so people can say no and throw rocks and stuff. That is actually a policy focus. So that's one of the things that we've really pushed back on this project, when people are making the very honest and earnest and good faith argument that you should look at all the jobs benefits and all the open space benefits and civic pride and even keeping the baseball team. And our pushback on that is that's to be expected with every single project that would ever ask for an amendment from the Bay Plan. So of course the city and the developer are going to say all of the great things that happen with their project. Otherwise, it wouldn't be something they were asking for a Bay Plan amendment for. Every new construction project is going to have construction jobs and provide value to the city. And if they're smart and they're building on the Bay, after having the last 50 years of BCDC in their life, they're going to plan for additional public access additional trails, additional parks, additional recreational facilities on the bay, maybe some additional wetlands or other eco restoration projects in the course of their project. That's a given. Those aren't justifications for an amendment, because if they were, you'd approve every amendment and then your plan wouldn't be worth anything.
Hey, before I get out of this part of our conversation, move to your document, what do you think of the gentleman from the BCDC board that was, I believe, there are a number of people who don't like that he's on it because they believe that he is biased against the project. What's saying you about that?
Well, so we've asked for the board chair, who's a friend of yours and a friend of mine, Zach
Wasserman, yeah,
to recuse himself.
Yeah.
Zach, again, is a friend. He's a good guy. He has his approach to a lot of things, which is informed by years and years and years of being involved in planning and other types of infrastructure development. And so he's obviously more than qualified to sit on BCDC and be its chair.
Now, there's also some guy that's, I forgot, David, I think his name is, who's a number of pro Howard Terminal people don't like because they believe that he's biased against the Howard Terminal project. And they said that he was also asked to step aside and not vote.
Well, I think they're referring to actual members of the Seaport Planning Advisory Committee.
Right.
Everyone on the Seaport Planning Advisory Committee had an interest in the development of that plan. Members of the port community were all on that advisory committee, making advice about planning for their own ports. Same thing. David Lewis was on there from Save the Bay. That's who I think you're referring to.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm referring to.
He has an opinion about this project, but he also has an opinion about all of the ports on the bay. So his opinion isn't limited just to this project. He's there specifically to provide the voice of people who are wanting to make sure that we're reducing bay fill. And it's a natural counterpoint to folks who are naturally predisposed to development. And you want your advisory committee to reflect all of those different viewpoints. And it did. So moving forward, our
so what you're saying basically is he represents democracy.
All of these regional
that is what you're saying.
Yeah, all of these regional planning systems, to have legitimacy, need to have everyone at the table when they're doing their plan development.
Well said.
Right, and so you can't turn around and say, this guy has an opinion. I can't believe he's at the table. Well, the reason he has a table is because he has an opinion. So I can see where folks from the outside that aren't used to doing this type of thing might be upset by it. But it's precisely how it's supposed to set up. You could say the exact same thing for the representative from the Port of Oakland who's sitting on the Seaport Planning Advisory Committee. He has a vested interest in what happens to the port and these projects, but he's voting on it. Is that fair? Well, yeah, because that's specifically how it's set up. And so that's not an indictment of any of those folks sitting on the advisory committee. It's actually an endorsement of why they're there. So that is different than the people who are actually sitting on the commission itself that are going to be casting binding votes and not just sitting there in an advisory capacity. I think it's pretty interesting. And going back to our friend Zach, I mean, that is the part of that conversation that is completely different than the conversation about what's going on with the advisory committee. So that conversation is gonna go on about whether or not it's appropriate for folks that have current or former relationships with applicants voting on these projects. And that's a conversation that
You know,
goes way beyond this, right?
in defense of Zach, although he's pissed off with me about, you know, giving away certain thoughts he had about the project, but hey, that's life. But in defense of Zach, I could look at anybody on that board from a particular angle and make a similar argument because they're all, I mean, let's face it, Mike, they're all accomplished people. They're experts in their areas. And so we don't know unless we look, right? How deep their relationships run. It doesn't matter if it's Dave or anybody else. So I don't think that's fair to Zach. You know, Zach just happens to be more of a public, he is more of a public figure in a group of people who are all public figures, right? So I don't think that's fair to him. You know?
Well, the question with Zach is whether or not his specific relationship with the Oakland A's, where he represented them in business issues,
right,
aside from this one, is enough of a conflict that he should recuse himself.
And here's why I argue no, because you and I don't know the reason why he's currently not in the employ of the Athletics. It could be negative. And so, you know, right. So my point is, why does anyone have the right to assume that because he had a relationship with the Athletics, it was positive? Okay. I mean, there are a lot of complicated personalities involved with these. We know all of them. Okay.
Yep, that's right.
Okay. So that's why I say it's not fair. It's not fair to Zach.
Yeah. And I think the response to that would be is public ethics rules aren't written to be fair. They're written to protect the integrity of a public process. And so you don't know, precisely to your point, you don't know what the nature of those relationships are, whether they're good or bad or indifferent. The point is to have someone making decisions that does not have those entanglements.
And I'm glad you brought that up because
and if you were an applicant, I turn it around the other way, right?
Sure.
If you were an applicant and you had a previous relationship with this person and it had gone sour, and there they were sitting as the chairman voting on your application,
mm-hmm,
you wouldn't want them there either.
But that exactly. But my point is that if that's the case and go either way, it becomes a wash. I'll give you an example. I'm talking about Scott McKibben, good friend of mine to this day, and it is known by some that he was accused of trying to affix for himself an extra payment from Ring Central. But in point of fact, and I have 4 now, some of them ex-board members of the Coliseum Authority will tell you that they asked him to go after the naming rights agreement with Ring Central, but they did not. And not only that, Scott never had instructions regarding what to do as a consultant, on top of the fact that his checks and contract hold him out as consultant. Okay. So he didn't know coming from the private sector, but the city and the county didn't tell him, which points to the poorly structured way the authority was set up and has been ran to date. All right. So should he be held hostage for that? Should he have been held hostage for that? The answer is no. But they did so anyway. And they did so selectively. They asked him, a number of people asked him to get tickets for them, the special games. This happened particularly during the NBA Finals. I can go on and on and on. My point is, we have to have a come to Jesus moment about public ethics because too often it's applied, we don't like somebody. And that's got to stop. And maybe we have a rule where if it's found that, you know, you, not you, but euphemistically, you have an issue with somebody else, then you have to recuse yourself as an official from any involvement in the call of public ethics because it's too rampant, Mike. It's too often it's used to hurt people on a personal level.
You know, I don't know the details of the other situation, but I think that the safe thing to say is that no one has a right to be in public service. And all of these public agencies have the responsibility and the duty to try to preserve as much integrity into what they do as possible. And that's never going to be a black and white question, right? There's always going to be a judgment there about where that line is. And sometimes it's easy. A lot of times it's hard.
To which Green would say, have another drink.
He would, but he would also properly disclose.
He would.
all of his spending that may have involved a drink with someone else.
Yep. Yeah,
They claim it.
yeah. No, he was quite the model at that.
He
And and to which he would say, "Have even another drink." So, moving along.
So one of the things that did come out of the hearing on the 2nd was, yes, please, was that they extended the public comment period by an extra day to the close of business on June 3rd, for people to provide new comments on issues that weren't raised before in the staff report, weren't discussed earlier, but came up during the meeting. And so you've got some of our supplemental comments. We did submit comments primarily on the biggest issue that come up, which had previously been discussed, which was the environmental justice policies of BCDC. So one of the things that came up was the question of whether or not BCDC's environmental justice policies would actually impact, as you're highlighting there, all of its actions and activities. And we had multiple commissioners say, it looks like we're not actually doing that at this point in time with this application. And so the staff needs to come back and decide on a substantive basis, are we going to be looking at environmental justice at this point in time or not? It's kind of a bit of an emperor has no clothes moment for BCDC when it has commissioners basically asking the question, are we going to analyze this project substantively or not? And the reason why that came up is because in the staff report for this project, it basically said the A's have satisfied our environmental justice components and our policies because they have a community benefits process. It didn't go into the outcome of that process. It didn't evaluate whether or not other aspects of the project would meet other components of the environmental justice policy, including around things like environmental degradation for disadvantaged communities, which is a huge issue. It basically just said they're talking to the community and therefore they've met the environmental justice social equity policy.
I don't know if I can do this while we're talking, but the document that Mike is referring to, if I can save these changes, I can't. So at any rate, what I'm going to do is tweet this out. So the document
Feel free.
You have is on Scrib. It's in my account, but I have just put it out on Twitter under hashtag under Howard Terminal PMSA, then hashtag Howard Terminal again there under one of my other accounts here. You just look at the hashtag for Howard Terminal on Twitter, folks, and you'll see it. And then I'm going to put it in the final video version of this that comes out. Oh, wait a minute. Stupid me. Hold on a second, folks. I just realized something. I can take it here, go over to YouTube, and then edit the video there rather than doing it through my device. And you say, and then in the description, just look for PMSA letter. Then the link is live, and yeah, so the updated version of this live stream on YouTube. So all you have to do is, if you want to see the entire letter in full or download it yourself, go to Scrib, go to the link, use Zenny62 YouTube. It's the live stream that's active right now. So all you have to do is on your app, fire up YouTube, and then go to my channel, Zenny62 here, and you can see, let me enlarge this for a second. You can see Mike's face, okay? And then that's the video. So all you have to do is, it's a little bit of here. so if you
It's alarming to see her face that big.
see, so at any rate, it's in the description here.
So if you alarming to see her
In
face
fact,
that big.
you at any rate, you see the link there?
It's in the description here.
There's the link. That's it. Okay, so there it is, folks. So you can get to it. You can get to it there now and enjoy the humor in the process since it's part of a delay.
Well, if you wouldn't mind scrolling through a little bit there,
Sure.
you'll see down the bottom of page 3, we have I quoted the actual Bay Plan Environmental Justice Policy number 4, which I think really kind of gets to the heart of the matter, and should be right below that, which is if you follow environmental justice policy 1, that's it right there.
Okay, got it.
If you follow environmental justice policy 1, which says you're supposed to include the evaluation of environmental justice in all of our decisions, then you find yourself needing to look at all the other environmental justice policies substantively and not just answer the question, did the A's reach out to the community or not? Because again, I mean, I think logically everyone would assume that if that was the baseline, then it's really a requirement that has little to no value. Everyone's going to go out to their community before they go out to BCDC and ask people to take a look at their project, because of the nature of this. You don't get to a place where you're asking for a Bay Plan amendment until you've done a lot of homework, right? In this case, all the environmental work is gone into certifying the EIR. They've spent hours and hours and hours with community meetings. Whether you think those were effective or not, those procedural things will step into place. But the meat of the matter is in environmental justice policies after the one that says we'll be actually including these things. And policy 4 says, if your project is in an underrepresented or disadvantaged community, which this is, then potential disproportionate impact should be identified in collaboration with the communities, and local governments and the commission should take measures through environmental review and permitting processes to require mitigation for disproportionate adverse project impacts on the identified vulnerable or disadvantaged communities in which the project is proposed.
Hey, right? Mike, I ask you, this is all well and good, but it really just begs the question, why not have a Coliseum alternative if it's this difficult? And look, I understand the A's position. I understand the desire for sponsorship money from that place. But as Joe Lacob said to me years ago, he believed that they could get the same sponsorship deal at the Coliseum as well that they got Chase Center, okay? So why doesn't someone, you have the African American Sports Entertainment Group, that has the ENA over that area, why don't they right now say, hey, here's an alternative for the A's to reconsider at the Coliseum? Why aren't you guys pushing for that rather than all this media hullabaloo? And the reason why I say it like that is because, Mike, a lot of the stuff out is completely ridiculous and it's unstructured. I'm telling you from a technical perspective, okay? It's annoying.
This is true.
You know, I mean, and it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. They don't know what they're talking about. So, I mean, and I'm not talking about both sides of the aisle, okay? It's ridiculous. And it shouldn't be played out in the media that has no idea what it's talking about.
Right.
Period. You know, and doesn't, all right? My point is, why not the alternative?
I think the alternative is exactly what we've been asking for. If there's a platform for us to do that, I would love to take you up on that. And part of it is tied up exactly in this question here, right? Which is at the stage we're at, you should be able to answer these questions, right? Have you effectively mitigated the project impacts? All right, you've gone through your environmental impact report. You're sitting here in a process that you knew was coming for the last 3 years. This is this is not the same, but it's almost entirely identical to the same frustrations that you've been expressing for years about the lack of ability to just be upfront about what the financing package is.
Right.
And then to formally go through the process to make that real. We're at the same place here. You're about to make this decision, and commissioners are asking the question, hey, are we going to actually analyze this or not? And no one has answered that question yet. And if you scroll down a little bit beyond this, I think the reason why it hasn't been scrutinized is, I apologize for the train. But if you keep on scrolling down to, we'll just go to the first.
They're coming for them, folks.
Yeah, that's the sound of commerce. The reason why they haven't been wanting to address these issues is because mitigation measures have left these impacts short of being addressed. So I put a couple charts in here that are reflective of the question of what would the actual application of this be. Here's one of them. So if your policy says you have to address disproportionate impacts by A, identifying them, and then B, mitigating them if your project would have disproportionate impacts on a disadvantaged community, then you got to answer questions like this, which is if you compare, again, this is from the EIR, so this is from the city, this is their study. They made a determination that there are significant unavoidable impacts in air quality after you've mitigated the project. So what does that actually mean? It means that when you compare what's proposed, construction plus operations, versus what's occurring now, you have 12 times the excess lifetime cancer risk in West Oakland.
Except I have to point out something, though.
Sure, please
There's
do.
a fine print right here that reads as follows, all right? Full build-out scenario. And then there's another one that says construction plus operations.
That's right.
Okay. But my point is, what I'm concerned about is full build-out scenario.
Right. So the full build-out scenario is 12 times higher than if you left the current port operations the way they are.
Right. But here's my point.
2029.
Right. But here's my point.
Right.
The full build-out scenario is $12 billion of construction. My assertion is that you're never going to see that. Okay. It's a guess because the A's don't have the financing to make it happen.
Well, I think you're right about that. But for purposes of the evaluation of what you're entitling, right, you would never make these assumptions based on the fact that you're not going to do what you got the entitlements for. Right. So if you just look at the current status of our operations, the cancer risk there per million people is 2.2.
Yeah.
What's proposed with A's construction plus operations is 8.3. And then once you get to the fully mitigated proposed stadium in 2029, that's that 3.6 versus 0.3.
Right.
Our operations emissions go down over time as our equipment gets cleaner.
Right.
Obviously, the A's full build-out scenario also is cleaner than the construction plus operations scenario because you don't have the additional emissions from the construction equipment and all the trucks that are there during construction. But even again, that's still higher than even if you just compared it to our current level of port operations and you didn't assume any technological improvement on air quality for our operations.
My only truck with this chart, though, is I'm going to bet you, to use Star Trek language, credits to Navy beans, you're not going to see that 3.6 because you're not going to see that full build-out scenario. You'll see 50% of it, okay? But
maybe
at 2029, ain't happening. I mean, look, the fact that there's already 2022, the A's are a good 2 years behind schedule on the project, arguably right now. So you're looking at what, 2024? then you start building just the stadium itself and perhaps another $1 billion in construction. You're looking at maybe 2028 before you see that. You're not going to go from, $2 billion of construction by 2028 to 12 billion by 2029.
Well,
Football is 1229.
I hear you.
12 billion. Okay, so that's what I'm saying. There needs to be a more realistic chart rather than just, I'm saying the same thing to you in a different way that I said to Dave Cavall when he was talking about, there's going to be, and Dave really started this garbage when he said, we're going to have $12 billion of economic impact. That I said, where are you getting that from? He says, well, I mean build out. I said, Dave, if you're going to have 12 billion in build out, then you've got to show what the total tax increment revenue is from the 12 billion. And to the date, they've never done it.
Well,
it's $9 billion. So my point is, there's a lot of, I'm sorry, Mike, but there's a lot of sloppiness here that's got to be called out, I love you as a friend,
I hear you, but these aren't our numbers.
Mm-hmm.
These are the numbers associated with the project from the environmental impact report adopted by the city using their methodology and their projections, and then applying them to our operations too as the baseline.
But then you do accept the fact that this is going to be a lower number in actual practice, right?
Well, it very well may be, and I think you're probably right. And but at the end of the day, that would also be true for everything else. Every time you hear someone talk about all the jobs you're going to get and the community benefits you're going to get and all those other things, I mean, that's true for everything.
Well, not exactly. And I think to challenge you
need
a little bit,
look at the entitlement process and make a decision in your BCDC, and you're looking at this from an environmental justice perspective, and you're supposed to say, over the next 3 decades, will this have a negative impact on a surrounding community? If you haven't looked at this, whether you think it's going to occur on this timeline or not, or whether you think the EIR was done well or not. By the way, we don't think the EIR is done well at all. So I'm not going to defend it except to say these are their numbers, their best foot forward, right? Their best estimate about what these numbers look like. This is it.
And I'm not defending it either, but I am saying that it's not a matter of saying everybody has a hyperbolic expectation or hyperbolic statistic, right? My point is that when people make hyperbolic statistics, they don't think through systemically what they mean. So if you say, hey, I've got a $12 billion build out, but you don't report what the tax increment throw off is, that's incomplete thinking. Hey, if you say, I've got a build out here and it's 3.6, but hey, they're never going to reach it, that's also incomplete thinking. All right. So my point, and we've lived enough life to know that the number of times we've seen a field build out of anything was maybe once or twice in our lives. I go back to when I was 9 years old and Illinois Center was proposed for Chicago, and I saw the model as part of Chicago 21. And when they didn't build it and didn't reach its build out, Mike, I was still a little boy and I cried. Okay. So you're still seeing the little boy in me say, don't do this sort of thing. All right. It's, it's, we never reached
it. Relative numbers, right? I think in the long and short of a lot of this is, maybe it's worth changing gears a little bit.
Yeah.
Is the narrative from the A's is this is a clean project, right? You're replacing dirty operations with clean operations, and everyone should just assume that the communities that are going to be hosting this are better off. And by their own admission and their own documentation here, that is just not true.
Right.
And it's not true with respect to this. This chart was lifetime cancer risk. If you go to a couple others, we compared a couple other things too out of the EIR. The next one is actually a comparison of what is from the EIR again. The existing emissions at the Coliseum versus a mitigated Howard Terminal. Again, this is, I think, assuming a full build out because it includes mitigated construction and mitigated operations emissions.
Yep.
But again, when you're looking at and this it just totally stands to reason. Does anyone think there are going to be fewer emissions than there are under the current circumstance at the Coliseum versus what's being proposed at Howard Terminal? And I think the reasonable answer should be no. You know that land use is more intensive. It's in a place where you're going to have a lot more activity. You have the impacts of the construction, and then the operations themselves are just a lot more intense. And if you take the A's comments at face value that they will essentially not be losing any parking, they're just using all of downtown as their parking lot, you're not having a real reduction in VMTs. You're just spreading them out, and they're not concentrated.
Right.
So these should not be a surprise to anybody. And then the other thing we put in another chart. If you wouldn't mind scrolling down to that.
Not at all.
Putting in context where we are versus port emissions. So the primary emission source at Howard Terminal right now is trucks. And it still will be if you don't do anything else to that site, if you don't approve the removal of the poor priority use area. But in the context of what these emissions mean to the community, the most important emissions reduction that we do is DPM. That's diesel particulate matter. Diesel particulate matter is an air toxic, and it has a lot of potential negative external impacts on communities. We have NOx on this chart too. This is from the port's 2020 emissions inventory, by the way. NOx emissions are a criteria pollutant. They have some residual public health impacts, but mainly what they do is they impact smog and overall air quality, which over time create cumulative air quality impacts. So alone, just having NOx as an emissions source isn't all that impactful, but when it accumulates over time in an air basin, think of Southern California, right, and their air quality problems. Over time, you generate a lot of air quality issues from NOx. It's a way oversimplified of an explanation, but and then obviously the other air quality measurement that people are interested in is in greenhouse gases, and that's the CO2e, the equivalent of carbon dioxide there. When we're looking at these from a public health point of view, from a community impact point of view, DPM and NOx are very important, right? Yep. Localized air toxic and your overall air quality and as a criteria pollutant in the air basin, those are both very important. Greenhouse gases are of course important, but they're not important to local health. There are lots of ways to address greenhouse gases that don't improve local air quality. And there's a lot of ways to improve local air quality without improving greenhouse gases. And that latter is what we have here. We've reduced our overall diesel particulate matter in the last 15 years by 87%. We've reduced our NOx by 40%, but we've only reduced our greenhouse gases at the port by 8%. We're not controlling for greenhouse gases, we're controlling for public health. And that's the environmental justice component of this. Are what you're doing, are the decisions you're making, are they having a disproportionate local impact on a community? So if you scroll down to the next chart, the reason why that's important is because in the context of all of the operations we have at the Port of Oakland, so all of the emissions from ocean-going vessels, from harbor craft, from our cargo handling equipment on terminal, from trucks, from locomotives and other equipment. In 2020, we emitted about 42.7 tons of particulate matter that year. And what's being proposed, again, a full build out of the A's stadium in 2029 is 26.6 tons of particulate matter. So when you compare all of our operations at the port, all of them. And those ocean-going vessel numbers, just by the way, are not just at berth. That includes ships when we're transiting in the bay, we're coming in from the pilot station. The trucks are not just on property there until you get onto the freeway. Anyways, all of those emissions in 2020 are about 42 tons. We need to reduce that. We're spending a lot of time and energy reducing it. It's a high priority of us and of the ports. But the A's project alone is 26.6 tons. And so again, when you're looking at this in the context of the fact that this is already a community that's burdened, as an industry, we're spending millions and millions of dollars on relatively small changes in the amount of emissions we have per ton. For the A's to walk in and say, we have the cleanest project you've ever seen, is just, it's laughable to us. If we proposed a new marine terminal, that's my light. If we proposed a new marine terminal that had this level of additional emissions, we would get laughed out of the room. The community would go crazy, and rightfully so. It would be irresponsible. But the A's walk in and say, this is the cleanest project you've ever seen. And how do they get to the place where they make that comment credibly and have people believe it? It's because they're talking about greenhouse gases. They're not talking about localized emissions impacts. And that's even problematic once you consider that the way that they'll get to most of their emissions reductions on greenhouse gases is through purchasing credits. So they don't have to actually reduce localized emissions to do that. They can buy those credits on the market, and they have the same effect because GHG impacts are global. If you reduce a pound of greenhouse gases in California, it's the same as reducing a pound of greenhouse gas in New York or in London or, in Taiwan or what have you. Any place in the world you reduce it, it's valuable. There's a real disconnect there. And I think that's one of the things that we're putting back again in these supplemental comments after hearing from folks on June 2nd, that they really want to have a substantive look at environmental justice, not just a procedural look at it. These are the kind of things you're going to have to be grappling with. If you're BCDC, how do I make sure I'm having an effective conversation about all of these things in the context of the policies of the Bay Plan?
And folks, I have a request to interview Dave, by the way, Dave Cabell, president of the A's. So just want to put that in. And also the mayor of Oakland, too.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. I mean, these issues don't go away, right? And so if you're just thinking about the context of this in a regional document where you're doing regional planning, it's important, right? You want to have these policies, you want to have them analyzed. If you're actually living in the community or working in the community, what does this mean? It means you're going to be substituting construction traffic for port traffic. And how does that impact your daily life? What does that look like during construction? And then post-construction, the irony is we don't think there is a substitution effect if you believe what the port and the A's and the city are telling people, which is there will be no impact on port operations. Well, if there's no impact on port operations, then you shouldn't have an expectation that there's less trucks. If there aren't less trucks, but there are port trucks, right? If there's no impact, you won't have less port trucks. So you have the same amount of port traffic, but you'll be adding in everything else. You'll be adding in construction traffic. You'll be adding in all the residential and office traffic, the folks who are attending the games. All of that is cumulative. It raises the question of how much does that local community feel like they need to bear?
On that note, again, folks, this entire document, this is not the end of it, of course. There are even more charts and tables here. But the entire document is now available right here on this YouTube live stream in the description section. It will also be on the blog versions of this, which will be at oaklandnewsnowblog.com and oaklandnewsonline.com, as well as oaklandfocus.blogspot.com and the other blogs owned by Zenny 62 Media. Great presentation, Mike.
Yeah, thanks for letting me share, Zenny. Really
Yeah.
appreciate it. And, if nothing else, this has always been a great forum for us to be able to have, big picture conversations. It's not Twitter. We're not going to have these conversations in 140 characters. People like to. Sometimes you just need to be a little bit more thoughtful about it and appreciate the forum.
Oh yeah, I much prefer this over that. Unless of course I happen to own Twitter, then that'd be a different story. But hey, Mike, clarify for me and for people watching, because the message tends to come out as if companies would prefer the A's move rather than build Howard Terminal. Is that the case?
No, I think the easy answer for everybody here is we want to have the same win-win for the city that we've had for the last 50 years. We have an incredible amount of investment and productive business in West Oakland surrounding the port and the infrastructure necessary to move goods. And we have 150 acres dedicated to reinvestment. Right now it's focused on two specific improvements in that area, but you can have so much more there. The environmental clearances already exist for that ballpark district to be something more than just a stadium and an arena. East Oakland deserves that investment, but more than that, from the public side, we've already built all of the infrastructure necessary to have that be a success. That the BART infrastructure, the freeway infrastructure, everything that you would need to have ingress and egress from a stadium is there. And we think Oakland's in a great place to preserve and reinvest in both. And so we think you can have a win-win and not set up this dynamic. Does that mean that that's what they want to do? Of course, it's not what they want to do. They've spent decades trying to, leave the Coliseum location and find other places to go. I'm not in the sports business. I can't second guess them too much. But from an urban planning point of view, we're entitled to an opinion just as much as they are. We think that reinventing the wheel in terms of the public infrastructure that you would need to replicate the scenario that you have at the Coliseum in the place where they're proposing is probably not realistic. And we think they've come to that conclusion too, because they're the ones that keep saying we need help with offsite infrastructure. They do. They need a lot of help with offsite infrastructure. And whether they do that through, targeted tax increment financing, whether they do that through getting public grants from the feds or from the state, whether or not they ask the city to pay for it through general funds, it's good and bad to all of it. But
I got to add just a few seconds we have left. Don't you think that the city could have ended that argument a long time ago if it simply stayed on schedule and implementing SB 293 Skinner and have the public have the infrastructure financing plan done and all the earmarks and all that?
I think more than that. Not only could they have had an answer for that done, they could have told us whether or not they intended to actually mitigate our impacts through a provision of additional infrastructure for maritime impacts. And they haven't done that. And that's our main frustration this whole time, is instead of dealing head on with the obvious problems that come from trying to shoehorn this project into an industrial area, they put their head in the sand and said, It'll be fine. Trust us. Don't worry.
Yeah.
That's a real
Mike, like the Legislative Authority was a deliberative body, the Coliseum a deliberative body. Yeah, procedural history, right? We have none of that with Howard Terminal. It's all over the place,
right.
And yet they expect to get it done. It's crazy stuff, Mike.
It's
crazy stuff.
It's there's just so many moving parts that it's not often that we have some real clarity about where you're making decisions on what basis. And I will say this for the BCDC process. It's a very clear process with respect to what it is that's being asked for and what the next step is. Right.
And again, it's a deliberative body, right? So
right.
Howard Terminal is getting bandied back and forth by these deliberative bodies, not its own. And the city expects to succeed at this?
That's right.
You don't do this in any other place in the country. It's crazy.
It also sets up a situation just because of the nature of this where everyone always has multiple bites at the apple with respect to a negotiation, which is not a situation which is conducive to getting a final deal. If you're the city, and even if you're predisposed to the deal, are you going to sign off on a final negotiation package with the A's until after you know what BCDC does on this decision? No. Are you probably going to do it before you know what the permit looks like? Probably not. Same thing's true with the A's. Why would you sign off on a final deal if you know that there's additional potential mitigation coming down the pike that you haven't accounted for? If the city is still telling you they're going to pay for offsite infrastructure, but they haven't demonstrated a capacity to do it, I wouldn't be leaping into a decision at this point either. I'd be waiting for the other person to blink and bid against themselves first. I think that's natural, and that's just how people should, in their own self-interest, be holding something back until they feel like this is the final time that I can make a deal.
And that should be the last word right there. Mike, a lot of fun, man. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you. Have a great weekend. Stay cool.
Stay in the heat. Stay backstage, folks. Hey, folks, tonight, Warriors Game 4. Go Warriors. Shutter. I'm going to have a special live stream about that at 9 o'clock Eastern, 6 o'clock Pacific. That ends this broadcast. Stick around in the background, Mike. Subscribe to Zinni62 on YouTube and bookmark oaklandnewsnowblog.com. And check out my old new recast blog, oaklandnewsonline.com. All right, we'll see you.